A broke artist drew a portrait for a dying man, unknowingly capturing the face of his estranged son. The revelation came later, after Marcus had already packed away his charcoals and bid farewell to the frail figure in the hospital bed. But in that moment, pencil scratching against paper, the old man's eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the sterile white walls, neither could have foreseen how a simple act of kindness would unravel decades of silence and regret. Marcus Holloway trudged through the January sleet, shoulders hunched against the biting wind that sliced through his threadbare coat. His fingers, red and chapped, clutched his portfolio case, a weathered leather satchel containing the sum total of his artistic aspirations and little else. The rejection letter from the Westridge Gallery was still crumpled in his pocket, where he'd stuffed it 3 hours ago before embarking on this aimless walk through the city. Not commercial enough, they'd said. Too raw. The same feedback he'd received from the last 4 galleries. Meanwhile, rent was due in 6 days, and the balance in his checking account had dwindled to double digits. He paused at a street corner, watching his breath form cloudy ghosts that dissipated into the gray afternoon. Across the intersection stood St. Mary's Hospital, its windows gleaming like tired eyes in the winter light. Marcus had no particular reason to go there. He knew no one inside, had no appointment. But something about the building's solid presence, its promise of warmth, drew him forward through the crosswalk. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps something more, what his mother might have called providence. Whatever it was, Marcus found himself in the hospital lobby, his numb fingers tingling painfully as they thawed in the sudden heat. "Can I help you?" The receptionist looked up with the practiced smile of someone who had asked that question 1,000 times that day. Marcus hesitated. What was he doing here? "I'm an artist. I was wondering if..." The words tumbled out before he could consider them. "If there might be anyone here who would like a portrait drawn? I don't charge much." It was Sister Helen who found him 20 minutes later, still standing awkwardly by the reception desk, halfway to convincing himself to leave. The elderly nun's face crinkled into a map of kind wrinkles as she approached. "You're the artist?" she asked, her voice gentle but direct. Marcus nodded, suddenly self-conscious of his dripping coat and unshaven face. "We have a patient in the palliative care unit, Mr. Aldridge, terminal pancreatic cancer." Her eyes, bright blue against her pale skin, held his gaze. "He doesn't have many visitors. No family that comes. I think he might appreciate what you're offering." The palliative care unit was quieter than the rest of the hospital, the lighting softer, the air heavier with unspoken endings. Marcus followed Sister Helen down a corridor where their footsteps seemed too loud, too intrusive. "He can be a bit gruff," she warned, pausing outside room 417. "But I think there's more there than he lets on." Edward Aldridge was a man disappearing. His body, once solid and commanding, had collapsed in on itself, leaving a fragile framework beneath the hospital sheets. His skin had taken on the translucent quality of parchment, stretched too tightly over the sharp angles of his face. But his eyes, deep-set and gray, burned with an intensity that startled Marcus. "Who's this?" Edward's voice was unexpectedly strong, a remnant of the man he had once been. Sister Helen made the introductions, explaining Marcus's offer. Throughout, Edward's gaze never wavered, assessing the young artist with unconcealed suspicion. "A portrait?" Edward finally said, after Sister Helen had excused herself. "What for?" "To remember this." He gestured toward his diminished form with undisguised contempt. Marcus set down his portfolio case, buying time. "Not to remember the illness," he said carefully. "To capture something else." "And what would that be?" Marcus met the older man's challenging stare. "That's what I'd have to discover, isn't it?" A moment passed between them, taut as a wire. Then unexpectedly, Edward's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. "How much?" Edward asked. Marcus thought of his empty refrigerator, the past due notices. $50? Edward barked a short laugh. "For a dying man's portrait? You're undervaluing your skills, boy. Either that, or they're not worth having." Heat crept up Marcus's neck. "I've been told my work isn't commercial enough." Good. Edward shifted in the bed, wincing slightly. "I have no interest in anything commercial. $100 and you'll do it properly." "Not this." He flicked a bony finger toward Marcus's satchel. "Rushed sketch nonsense." They agreed that Marcus would come back the next day to begin. As he left the hospital and stepped back into the cold, Marcus felt something he hadn't in weeks, a small, warm spark of purpose. When Marcus returned the following afternoon, he found Edward sitting up in bed, hair combed, wearing a button-down shirt instead of a hospital gown. A small table had been set up near the window. "Sister Helen," Edward explained, seeing Marcus's surprise. "Woman thinks she's directing a formal portrait for Buckingham Palace." Over the next 2 hours, Marcus arranged his materials and began preliminary sketches. Edward was a surprisingly good subject, sitting still with a patience that belied his earlier gruffness. They spoke little at first, the scratch of pencil on paper filling the silence. "What did you do before all this?" Marcus finally asked, gesturing vaguely toward the hospital room. Edward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Construction. Had my own company. Built half the modern skyline in the city. Not that anyone would remember now. Successful then? Very." The word hung in the air, laden with something that Marcus couldn't yet identify. Pride, certainly, but underneath it, something heavier. As the afternoon light began to fade, Marcus packed up his materials. He had several rough sketches, studies of Edward's face from different angles. None had yet captured what he was looking for, that elusive something beyond the illness, beyond the present circumstances. "Same time tomorrow?" Marcus asked. Edward nodded, suddenly looking exhausted. "Bring coffee. The stuff they serve here should be classified as a biological weapon." Days stretched into a week. Marcus arrived each afternoon with 2 coffees, one black for Edward, one with cream and sugar for himself. He worked methodically on the portrait, using charcoal and chalk on toned paper. Edward gradually revealed pieces of his life, his rise from apprentice carpenter to construction magnate, his pride in buildings that would outlast him, his late wife Caroline, who had died 15 years earlier. But there were gaps, silences that fell suddenly in the middle of stories. Marcus sensed walls around certain topics, and he didn't press. Something was holding Edward back, keeping parts of himself locked away, even as Marcus tried to capture the whole of him on paper. On the 5th day, Marcus was working quietly when Edward spoke unprompted. "I had a son." Marcus's hand stilled, charcoal hovering above the paper. He waited. "Chatham. James." Edward's voice had softened, carrying a weight that seemed to press him deeper into the hospital bed. "He'd be about your age now. Maybe a bit older." Marcus carefully resumed his work, afraid that any sudden movement might cause Edward to retreat back behind his walls. "Where is he now?" The silence stretched so long that Marcus thought Edward wouldn't answer. When he finally did, his voice was like gravel. "I don't know." The portrait was taking shape now. Marcus had captured the strong, architectural bones of Edward's face, the determined set of his jaw. But it was the eyes that he kept returning to, trying to render the fierce light that still burned there. And now, the profound sadness he had glimpsed. "We had a falling out," Edward continued, his gaze fixed on the window. "When he was 19, he wanted to be an artist of all things." A bitter laugh escaped him. "I had built this company from nothing, created this legacy, and he wanted to throw it all away for something so impractical." Marcus kept his expression neutral, though his hand tensed around the charcoal. "The things I said to him," Edward shook his head slightly. "The things he said back." He walked out that night. "Caroline begged me to go after him, to apologize, but I was too proud, too convinced I was right." His voice dropped to nearly a whisper. Then years passed, and it became harder to know how to bridge that gap. "And now, have you tried to find him?" Marcus asked quietly. "Over the years, yes, hired people even. He changed his name, apparently. Wanted nothing to do with the Aldridge legacy." Edward's hands twisted in the sheets. "Can't say I blame him." Marcus worked in silence for a while, digesting this. He thought of his own father, who had died when Marcus was 12. A quiet, gentle man who had always encouraged his son's artistic tendencies, even when they couldn't afford proper supplies. "It's never too late," Marcus said finally, immediately regretting the platitude. With Edward's diagnosis, it very well might be too late. Edward seemed to read his thoughts. 3 months, maybe 4, they tell me. Not much time to undo 23 years of silence." He closed his eyes. "I'm tired today. Perhaps we should continue tomorrow." Marcus packed up silently, troubled by the sorrow that had settled over the room like dust. That night, in his small apartment, Marcus spread out his sketches and studies. The portrait was coming together, but something was missing, some essential truth about Edward that he hadn't yet captured. He thought about Edward's estranged son, the regret that had cracked through the older man's carefully maintained facade. Marcus worked late into the night, not on the commissioned portrait, but on something else entirely, a different version of Edward. Younger, stronger, but with the same piercing eyes. The Edward who might have walked his son to school, taught him to ride a bike, argued with him across a dinner table. The Edward who existed before regret had carved its deep channels into his face. When he finally fell into bed, the new drawing was propped against his wall. Edward Aldridge as he might have been 20 years ago, in the prime of his life and success. It was good work, perhaps some of Marcus's best, though he wasn't sure why he had felt compelled to create it. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the hospital to find Edward's room in disarray. A nurse explained that he had suffered a setback overnight. Severe pain, difficulty breathing. They had increased his medication, and he was resting now. Edward was asleep when Marcus entered, his breathing shallow and labored. Sister Helen stood by the bed, her face drawn with concern. "Perhaps you should come back another day," she suggested gently. But as she spoke, Edward's eyes fluttered open. They took a moment to focus, clouded with medication. "You're here," he said, his voice barely audible. "I can come back when you're feeling better," Marcus offered. "No." The word was firm despite its weakness. "Continue. Not much time for postponements in my situation." Sister Helen gave Marcus a worried look, but left them alone. Marcus set up his materials quietly, casting frequent glances at Edward, who drifted between consciousness and sleep. The older man's condition cast a new urgency over the portrait. This was no longer just about earning $100. It was about capturing something essential before it was gone forever. "Tell me about him," Marcus said when Edward's eyes were open and alert. "Your son." A look of surprise crossed Edward's face, followed by hesitation. Then, as if a dam had broken, words began to spill out. "James was always drawing. From the time he could hold a crayon, not buildings or cars like other boys, he drew people. Faces. Said he liked finding the stories in them." Edward's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "He had his mother's eyes. Her kindness, too. And your stubbornness?" Marcus suggested with a small smile. Edward's laugh turned into a cough. "God help him, yes." He paused, collecting himself. "He was brave. Braver than I ever was. To walk away from everything, to follow his own path. It took me too long to see that." As Edward spoke, Marcus worked intently, his charcoal moving with newfound purpose. Something was emerging in the portrait now. A depth, a complexity that had been missing before. Not just the Edward of the present, ravaged by illness and regret, but layers of the man he had been throughout his life. "The last thing he said to me," Edward continued, his voice dropping low, "was that I had built a company but never a home. That I had constructed buildings but demolished our family." His hands trembled slightly on the blanket. He was right. I realized it too late. Marcus worked in silence for a while, letting Edward rest. The portrait was nearing completion now, something powerful taking shape on the paper. He wasn't sure exactly what was guiding his hand, whether it was Edward's stories or something more intuitive, some connection that had formed between artist and subject. "May I ask you something personal?" Edward said suddenly, his eyes sharp despite his weakened state. Marcus nodded. "Your parents, are they proud of what you do? Your art?" The question caught Marcus off guard. "My father died when I was young. My mother," he thought of her, working double shifts as a nurse to support them, her tireless encouragement of his talent, even when it seemed impractical. "Yes, she's proud. She doesn't always understand my work, but she's always believed in me." Something like pain flickered across Edward's face. "You're fortunate?" The next day, Edward was stronger, sitting up when Marcus arrived. The portrait was nearly complete. Marcus needed only to refine some details, to add the final touches that would bring it fully to life. As he worked, Edward spoke again of James, memories flowing more freely now. The time James had rescued a wounded falcon and nursed it back to health in their garage. His high school art show that Edward had missed due to a business meeting. The Christmas James had given his father a hand-drawn portrait of Caroline that had brought tears to Edward's eyes. The only time James had ever seen his father cry. "I kept that portrait in my office for years," Edward said. "It's in storage now, with everything else from my house. I couldn't bear to look at it after he left. It reminded me too much of what I'd lost, of my own failures." As the afternoon light began to wane, Marcus added the final touches to the portrait. He had never worked with such focus, such clarity of purpose. When he finally set down his charcoal, a strange hush fell over the room. "It's finished," he said quietly. Edward straightened in the bed, his expression suddenly uncertain. "Let me see." Marcus turned the easel toward him. For a long moment, Edward said nothing. His face went through a series of transformations, surprise, confusion, then something deeper, more visceral. His hands gripped the sheets as if to steady himself. "Hannah, how did you..." Edward's voice broke. "How could you know?" Marcus looked at the portrait, seeing it through Edward's eyes. He had captured the man before him. Yes, the proud set of the jaw, the architectural strength of the features, even as illness had wasted them away. But there was something else there too, some quality in the eyes and the particular curve of the smile that wasn't entirely Edward's. "Know what?" Marcus asked, genuinely confused. "That's James," Edward whispered. "In my face, that's my son you've drawn." Marcus stared at the portrait, then back at Edward. He hadn't consciously drawn anyone but the man before him. And yet, was it possible that in trying to capture the essence of Edward, he had somehow channeled the son who was so much on the older man's mind? Or was it simply that the family resemblance was strong enough that Edward, in his emotional state, was seeing what he desperately wanted to see? "I didn't know," Marcus said truthfully. "I just drew what I saw in you." Edward's eyes filled with tears, the first Marcus had seen from him. "Then what you saw was the best part of me, the part that lives in him." The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sister Helen entered, accompanied by a doctor who needed to examine Edward. Marcus packed up his materials, promising to return the next day with the finished, mounted portrait. That night in his apartment, Marcus studied the portrait with new eyes. He could see it now, how certain qualities of the face he had rendered seemed to belong to a younger man. How there was a gentleness around the eyes that spoke more of how Edward might have been, rather than how he currently appeared. It wasn't exactly that he had drawn two people in one portrait, but rather that he had somehow captured the thread that connected father and son across years of estrangement. Beside the portrait, he placed the drawing he had made several nights before, the younger version of Edward that he had created on impulse. Looking at them side by side, he felt a chill run down his spine. The resemblance was uncanny, not between the two drawings of Edward, but between his imagined younger Edward and the qualities of James that had somehow emerged in the portrait. Marcus barely slept that night, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. The next morning, he mounted the portrait carefully in a simple frame he had purchased with part of the advance Edward had paid him. When he arrived at the hospital, however, he found Edward's room in chaos. Monitors beeping, nurses moving quickly, a doctor barking orders. Sister Helen ushered him back into the hallway. "He took a turn in the night," she explained, her voice tight with concern. "His body is shutting down. They're trying to stabilize him, but he's dying." Marcus finished for her. "Really dying right now." She nodded, her eyes filled with compassion. "It might be best if you came back another time." Marcus clutched the portrait to his chest. "No, I need to give this to him. Today." After what seemed like an eternity, the medical team emerged from Edward's room. The doctor's face was grim as he spoke quietly to Sister Helen. Marcus caught fragments. Comfortable as possible. Not much longer. Hours, maybe. When they were finally allowed in, Edward was still, his breathing labored. The room was dimmed, the harsh hospital equipment creating ominous shadows on the walls. Sister Helen touched Edward's hand gently. "Mr. Aldridge? Edward? Marcus is here." Edward's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening slightly as they found Marcus. "You came," he whispered. "I brought the portrait." Marcus moved closer, turning the frame drawing so Edward could see it. Even in his weakened state, Edward's reaction was profound. His hand reached out, trembling, to touch the glass over the drawing. "James," he said, the name of prayer on his lips. "I'm going to leave this here with you," Marcus said, propping the portrait on the side table where Edward could see it from the bed. Edward's eyes hadn't left the drawing. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice so faint that Marcus had to lean close to hear. "In my wallet, there's a card for a lawyer. Patterson, he handles my affairs." Marcus glanced at Sister Helen, who nodded and retrieved Edward's personal effects from a drawer. She found the wallet and inside it, a business card which she handed to Marcus. Call him," Edward continued, each word clearly costing him effort. "Tell him about the portrait, about James. He'll understand." Marcus took the card, confused but unwilling to question a dying man. "I will, I promise." Edward's eyes drifted closed, his breathing becoming more ragged. Marcus sat with him for another hour, until Sister Helen gently suggested he go home and get some rest. Edward had fallen into unconsciousness, she explained, and might not wake again. Marcus left reluctantly, the business card burning a hole in his pocket. Edward Aldridge died at 3:17 the following morning. Marcus received the call from Sister Helen just after dawn. He wasn't alone, she assured him. "I was with him. And your portrait, he could see it until the end." Marcus thanked her, his throat tight with an unexpected grief. He had known Edward for less than 2 weeks, yet the loss felt strangely personal. Later that day, numb and unsure what else to do, Marcus called the number on the lawyer's card. Patterson's secretary put him through immediately upon hearing Edward's name. "Mr. Aldridge mentioned you might call," Patterson said, his voice professionally neutral. "I understand you're an artist? You did a portrait for him?" "Yes," Marcus confirmed, still uncertain why this mattered to Edward's lawyer. "Mr. Aldridge updated his will last week. He instructed that in the event of his death, I was to inquire about a portrait he commissioned and whether the artist would be willing to undertake a special task." Marcus listened with growing confusion as Patterson explained. Edward had left specific instructions and a substantial sum of money for Marcus to use his artistic skills to help locate James Aldridge. The will specified that the portrait should be photographed and used in the search, along with other resources Patterson would provide. "I don't understand," Marcus said finally. "Why me? There are professional investigators. Mr. Aldridge believed you had a connection of sorts. He felt you had seen something in him that others had missed, including apparently a resemblance to his son that might help in identifying him." Patterson's tone suggested he found this somewhat unconventional, but was bound to follow his client's wishes. He was quite insistent, said you had the eye to find him. 3 days later, Marcus found himself in Patterson's office, surrounded by boxes of Edward's personal effects, photographs of a younger Edward with his wife Caroline, James's high school yearbook, old letters, holiday cards, the accumulated evidence of a family that had once been whole, and there, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, the portrait of Caroline that James had drawn as a teenager, the Christmas gift Edward had mentioned. Marcus unwrapped it with reverent hands, studying the confident lines, the remarkable skill evident even in this youthful work. He was talented, Marcus murmured, a strange kinship forming with this unknown artist. Edward thought so too, eventually, Patterson said. Too late to tell his son, unfortunately. The search began in earnest. James Aldridge had changed his name after leaving home, but Patterson's investigators had some leads. He had attended art school briefly in Chicago before dropping out. There were records of someone matching his description working in various cities across the country. Always art-related jobs, gallery assistant, frame shop worker, community art teacher. Marcus devoted himself to the search with an intensity that surprised him. He had his own work, his own struggles, yet finding James had become inexplicably important. Perhaps it was the promise he had made to Edward, or perhaps it was something deeper, a recognition of what it meant to be an artist in a world that often devalued such pursuits, an understanding of what might have driven James away and what might help bring him, if not back, then at least to some kind of closure. Weeks passed. Leads went cold. Marcus's own finances dwindled again as he split his time between the search and his artwork. The payment from Edward had helped temporarily, but it wasn't enough to sustain him for long. Then unexpectedly, a breakthrough. A small community arts center in Oregon had employed a teacher named James Carson, whose date of birth matched James Aldridge's. The center had closed 2 years ago, but they had forwarded a portfolio of work samples that the teacher had left behind. When the package arrived at Patterson's office, Marcus tore it open with trembling hands. Inside were several sketches and small paintings, landscapes, still lifes, and portraits. The style was distinctive, confident, with a particular attention to faces that reminded Marcus of something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't until he reached the last piece, a self-portrait in charcoal, that everything fell into place. The face looking back at him from the paper was startlingly familiar. The same strong jaw as Edward, the same architectural bones, but with a gentleness around the eyes that Marcus had captured in Edward's portrait. More shocking still was the resemblance to Marcus's own imagined drawing of a younger Edward, the one he had created on pure instinct. "It's him," Marcus whispered. "We found him." Patterson made the necessary arrangements. The Arts Center provided a last known address for James Carson in Portland, Oregon. Marcus insisted on going himself, carrying both Edward's portrait and James's self-portrait in a protective case. The small house on the outskirts of Portland was painted a soft blue, with a wild garden of native plants surrounding it. Marcus stood on the porch for a long moment, heart pounding, before finally ringing the bell. The man who opened the door was in his early 40s, with streaks of gray in his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. But it was the eyes themselves that Marcus recognized instantly. The same intense gray as Edward's, though warmer, less guarded. "James Carson?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes?" The man regarded him with polite curiosity. "Can I help you?" "My name is Marcus Holloway. I'm an artist." He hesitated, suddenly unsure how to continue. "I knew your father." James's expression shuddered immediately, the warmth in his eyes replaced by a wariness that reminded Marcus painfully of Edward. "I think you must be mistaken. My father and I haven't spoken in over 20 years. "Edward Aldridge," Marcus said quietly. "He died 3 months ago." Something flickered across James's face, too complex to read. He said nothing for a long moment, then stepped back from the door. "You'd better come in." The inside of the house was modest but filled with art. Paintings on every wall, sculptures on tables, a studio visible through an open door where an easel stood by a window flooded with natural light. "You've continued with your art," Marcus observed. James nodded, his movements stiff as he led Marcus to a small sitting area. "Despite my father's predictions of starvation and failure, yes." There was an old bitterness in his voice, though tempered now by time. "He kept track of you, you know," Marcus said. "Hired people to find you over the years." James's mouth twisted, but never came himself. "No, pride, I think. And then illness." Marcus carefully opened his portfolio case. "He was dying when I met him. Terminal cancer. He hired me to draw his portrait." James watched silently as Marcus removed the framed portrait of Edward and placed it on the coffee table between them. For a long moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable as he studied the drawing. "You captured him well," he finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "The stubbornness, the strength. He saw you in it," Marcus said quietly. "When I showed him the finished portrait, he said I had somehow drawn you in his face. I didn't understand at the time, but..." He hesitated, then removed the second drawing from his case, James's self-portrait from the Art Center. He placed it beside Edward's portrait. James stared at the two drawings side by side, his composure finally cracking. A tremor passed through him as he reached out to touch first one, then the other. "He talked about you," Marcus continued softly, "in his final days, about how proud he was of your talent, how he regretted the things he said, the way he failed to support your art." 23 years, James whispered. "He had 23 years to tell me that himself." "I know." Marcus met his gaze directly. "He knew too. He said you were right, that he had built buildings but demolished his family, that you were braver than he ever was." James stood abruptly, walking to the window. His back to Marcus, he asked, "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" "Nothing," Marcus answered honestly. "Your father left instructions with his lawyer. He wanted you found. He wanted you to know." He faltered, realizing there had been no specific message, no last words of love or apology. "I think he wanted you to know that he saw you finally, that he understood what he had lost." James turned back, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's too late." "For him, yes," Marcus agreed, "but not for you." The silence that followed was heavy with unresolved grief, with the weight of words never spoken and apologies never made. Finally, James picked up Edward's portrait again, studying it with the eye of a fellow artist. "You're talented," he said. "Your work has soul." "Thank you," Marcus replied, unexpectedly moved by the compliment. "He paid you, I assume?" "My father was never one for charity." Marcus smiled slightly. $100. He said I was undervaluing my work when I asked for 50. A surprised laugh escaped James, perhaps the first genuine emotion he had shown. "That sounds like him." "There's more," Marcus added. "He left money in his will. For me to find you, yes, but also a trust. For your art, to support your work, no strings attached." James went still. "I don't want his money." "I understand, but maybe it's not about the money. Maybe it's about him finally doing what he should have done 23 years ago. Believing in your talent, investing in your vision." They talked for hours as the afternoon light shifted across the room. James showed Marcus his studio, his current projects, powerful, evocative portraits that echoed the skill Marcus had seen in the teenage drawing of Caroline. Marcus shared stories of Edward's final days, the regret and pride that had mingled in the dying man's words. As evening approached, James made coffee, and they sat again before the two portraits. "I don't know if I can forgive him," James said finally. "Not yet. Maybe not ever completely." "I think he knew that," Marcus replied. "I don't think forgiveness was what he was asking for in the end. Just acknowledgement, maybe. Recognition that despite everything, you were connected. That something of him lived in you, and something of you in him." James's hand moved to rest on Edward's portrait. "What will you do now?" he asked Marcus, Keep drawing, I suppose. Keep trying to capture the truth of people, even when they can't see it themselves. He smiled ruefully. Try to pay my rent. You're struggling? As an artist? Marcus shrugged. The usual story. Not commercial enough. Too focused on the emotional rather than the decorative. James was quiet for a moment, considering. I teach classes at a local arts center, and I have connections at several galleries that focus on narrative portraiture. He hesitated. Perhaps we could talk more about your work. If you're interested, it was a small opening, a tentative connection. Not quite an offer of friendship, but the possibility of one. Marcus recognized it for the significant gesture it was. I'd like that, he said simply. When Marcus left that evening, James kept Edward's portrait. Not displayed prominently, not yet, but carefully set aside rather than returned. A first step, perhaps, towards some kind of reconciliation with the past. 6 months later, Marcus stood in a small gallery in Portland, surrounded by his work. A series of portraits that told stories of connection, loss, and redemption. The centerpiece was a new drawing of Edward Aldridge, created from memory and emotion rather than direct observation. In this version, Edward was neither the dying man in the hospital bed, nor the imagined younger man, but something in between, a figure caught in the act of reaching out, his expression one of hope mingled with regret. Beside it hung a portrait of James, his eyes reflecting the same complex emotion, his hand extended slightly as if to complete a connection long deferred. The show was called Estrangement, and it had already received critical attention that had eluded Marcus's previous work. James had been instrumental in arranging the exhibition, using his local connections and his eye for curation to present Marcus's art in its most powerful light. As visitors moved through the gallery, Marcus found himself standing before the paired portraits of father and son. He felt a presence beside him and turned to find James, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. Successful night, James observed, handing one to Marcus. 3 sold already and serious interest in the others. Marcus nodded his thanks, both for the champagne and for everything else unspoken between them. Over the months, they had developed a cautious friendship, bound by art and by the strange, posthumous connection to Edward. I've been thinking, James said after a moment, about forgiveness. Marcus waited, giving him space to continue. I always thought it was something you either granted or withheld, a gift for the person who wronged you. James's eyes were fixed on the portrait of his father. But maybe it's not that simple. Maybe it's a process, something that happens in stages, in moments. Like healing, Marcus suggested. Yes, like healing. James took a breath. I'm not there yet, but I'm closer than I was 6 months ago. They stood in companionable silence, watching as a young couple lingered before the portraits, heads tilted in contemplation. I never told you, James said suddenly. When you first showed me that portrait you drew of my father, the one where you somehow captured my face in his, it reminded me of something I'd done years ago. What? What was that? After I left home, when I was still in art school, I did a self-portrait. But when it was finished, I realized I'd unconsciously included elements of my father's face in my own. I was so angry about it that I destroyed the drawing. A small, sad smile crossed his lips. I couldn't escape him even then. Even in my own art, Marcus thought of the portrait hanging on the wall before them, of the invisible threads that connected people across time and distance, through estrangement and reconciliation. Maybe that's what art does, he said quietly, reveals the connections we can't always see ourselves. As the evening continued around them, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here, from a broke artist trudging through winter sleet to this moment of professional recognition and unexpected friendship. All because he had drawn a portrait for a dying man, unknowingly capturing the face of his estranged son. In the end, perhaps that was the true power of art. Not just to reflect what was visible, but to reveal what was hidden, to draw connections across the empty spaces between people, to offer, if not healing itself, then at least the beginning of a path toward it. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, not the tearful reunion Edward might have hoped for in his final days. James would never have the chance to speak with his father again, to hear an apology directly from him, to work through their complex history face to face. But in the quiet space of the gallery, surrounded by images that spoke of both separation and connection, something had shifted. A circle had not closed completely, but perhaps had begun to spiral toward a center neither father nor son had been able to imagine in life. And Marcus, the broke artist who had accidentally set it all in motion with a single portrait, found himself no longer an outsider to their story, but an essential part of it. The unexpected bridge between past and future, between what was lost and what might yet be found.